Welcome to This Explainer. If you've been following the year-to-date headline news trends coming out of Washington and Ottawa, you know things have been incredibly tense. But today, we're going to investigate how a massive, macro-level geopolitical trade war has triggered a totally bizarre micro-level crisis involving millions of tons of literal garbage. We're talking about a story that connects local town councils right up to international trade courts and the highest political offices. So let's start with a really staggering number. Every single year, a massive 3.46 million tons of municipal solid waste, we're talking everyday garbage, are shipped from Ontario, Canada, straight across the U.S. border into Michigan landfills. To put that into perspective for you, picture a continuous daily convoy of heavy trash trucks navigating international border crossings for the sole purpose of dumping Canadian household and commercial waste right into American soil. And this graph brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of this logistical pipeline. It's totally structural. Ontario's exported garbage accounts for a whopping 14.35% of all waste disposed of in the entire state of Michigan. So we're not just looking at a couple of friendly border towns sharing resources here. We are looking at a deeply ingrained dependency where a major Canadian province heavily relies on an American state for its most basic municipal functioning. Today, we're going to unpack the trade war behind this cross-border flow. Here's our roadmap. Section 1, the cross-border waste corridor. Section 2, tariffs and trade war escalation. Section 3, USMCA, trash as a commodity. Section 4, Michigan fights foreign garbage. Section 5, Ontario's domestic landfill scramble. And finally, Section 6, the 2026 USMCA showdown. Okay, moving right into Section 1, the cross-border waste corridor. Let's look at why it actually makes economic sense to truck garbage hundreds of miles across an international border in the first place. The core economic pull factor here boils down to Michigan's historically rock-bottom dumping rate, which is known in the waste industry as a tipping fee. At just 36 cents per ton, it is immensely cheaper for Ontario haulers to simply pack up their trash and export it, rather than navigate their own province's strict environmental regulations and high local disposal costs. See, back in the 1990s, Michigan actually overbuilt its landfill capacity, which drove prices way down. Today, that legacy of cheap space acts like a massive magnet for foreign garbage. Section 2. Tariffs and trade war escalation. Let's see what happened when this everyday logistical pipeline recently collided head-on with a multi-billion-dollar international trade dispute. If we track the year-to-date metadata, we see a really rapid, intense escalation. It all kicked off in late 2024, when President Trump threatened a universal 25% tariff on Canadian imports, totally rattling North American markets. In response, Ontario Premier Doug Ford triggered a snap election in early 2025, just to secure a hardened mandate to counter Washington. By March 2025, those U.S. tariffs were implemented, and Ontario hit back, retaliating with a 25% surcharge on electricity exported to U.S. states, including Michigan. This intense back-and-forth volley continued until a major February 2026 U.S. Supreme Court decision struck down the administration's use of emergency economic powers for these unilateral tariffs. Throughout all of this chaos, Premier Ford leaned heavily into a defensive Team Canada posture. As you can see from this quote, he explicitly stated that if Ontario is attacked, they will use every single tool in their toolbox to defend Ontarians and Canadians. Both sides were actively weaponizing their highly integrated supply chains. We're talking threats to steel, aluminum, and even the cross-border electricity grids. Which brings us to Section 3, USMCA, trash as a commodity. Let's look at one of the absolute wildest loopholes in international trade law affecting this exact corridor. Under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, municipal solid waste disposal isn't treated as a nuisance or even an environmental liability. Surprisingly, MSW is legally classified as a protected, tax-free commerce commodity. Because it met USMCA rules of origin, it was entirely shielded from the exact same tariffs that were disrupting almost every other industry during this trade dispute. The absolute irony of this situation cannot be overstated. While essential, highly valuable goods like Canadian steel, aluminum, and critical energy exports were being threatened with crippling duties of up to 25%, millions of tons of literal garbage were quietly crossing the border completely untaxed. The USMCA trade framework was effectively incentivizing the free movement of trash while actively restricting the movement of actual treasure. Section 4, Michigan fights foreign garbage. Because obviously Michigan lawmakers and residents aren't just sitting idly by as their state absorbs all this waste. To deter this constant influx of foreign and out-of-state waste, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer proposed drastically raising that rock-bottom tipping fee. Her executive budget proposed taking the fee from a mere 36 cents all the way up to $5 per ton. The goal is pretty straightforward: close the massive cost gap that makes Michigan the absolute cheapest dumping ground in the entire Great Lakes region. And this hike isn't just about being punitive. It has very real domestic goals. It's designed to generate $80 million in ongoing revenue. Why? Well, Michigan has over 24,000 contaminated sites that require urgent environmental remediation. Furthermore, the state's own dwindling landfill capacity currently only has about 21 years left. By pricing out that Canadian waste, Michigan hopes to preserve its own infrastructure and mitigate the serious greenhouse gas emissions that come with importing millions of cubic yards of trash. Moving on to Section 5, Ontario's domestic landfill scramble. Across the border, the constant threat of those U.S. tariffs and Michigan's pushback has triggered absolute legislative chaos. The ticking clock here is severe, folks. Under normal conditions, Ontario's domestic landfills actually have until about 2037 before they are totally full. But if geopolitical tensions culminate in the U.S. closing the border to Canadian waste, that timeline completely collapses. Ontario's domestic landfills will be entirely exhausted by the year 2034. That is less than a decade away to figure out what to do with millions of tons of garbage. So to prevent this impending disaster, the Ford government took some really drastic action regarding a controversial landfill project near Dresden, Ontario, operated by a company called York One. Now, initially, expanding this site required a comprehensive multi-year environmental assessment. But through a piece of legislation known as Bill 5, the provincial government completely bypassed this requirement. As you can see here, they shifted the primary mechanism to a rapid processing environmental compliance approval that shrinks a 6 to 10-year scientific study down to a fast-track bypass, heavily restricting public oversight with very minimal community comment windows. And this was despite intense pushback from local residents and First Nations groups. And what was the justification for this unprecedented subnational maneuvering? Well, as Premier Ford explicitly stated, the government justified bypassing local environmental planning as a necessary geopolitical defense against Washington's unpredictable border policies. In essence, local environmental regulations were overwritten in the name of international trade security. Finally, Section 6, the 2026 USMCA showdown. All of this local and subnational friction leads us directly back onto the world stage. Mark your calendars. On July 1, 2026, trade ministers from the United States, Mexico, and Canada will convene for the highly volatile USMCA joint review. What literally started as a local issue of tipping fees and trash trucks is now going to be heavily leveraged as a key diplomatic instrument in these high-stakes macroeconomic negotiations. The stakes for this review are absolutely monumental, largely due to the agreement's sunset clause. If the three nations can unanimously agree, the pact gets a nice, stable 16-year extension. But if the parties clash over these exact issues, tariffs, border security, or environmental compliance, the pact enters what trade analysts ominously call zombie mode. This triggers a really volatile cycle of mandatory annual reviews that could ultimately collapse the entire North American trade framework by 2036. So, as we watch 3.46 million tons of garbage freely cross the border, completely tax-free, right in the middle of a trade war threatening billions of dollars in essential goods, we are left with a critical thought. When subnational policies clash so deeply with international treaties, what actually happens to our interconnected realities and our supply chains when the USMCA faces this ultimate stress test in 2026? It's a massive question, and it's one that will affect everything from the cost of the goods we buy to exactly where our trash ends up. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.